My name is Jessica Williams, and I'm 28 years old. 3 months ago, I stood outside the Phoenician Resort in Scottsdale, Arizona, watching limousines pull up to my own brother's wedding while security guards told me I wasn't welcome inside. My brother Mike had just told me over the phone that bringing the grocery store girl would embarrass him in front of his Fortune 500 guests. What he didn't know was that the building his reception was being held in was owned by a company that had my signature on every major contract. What he discovered that night changed everything, and I mean everything, about our family forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The March heat in Phoenix was already climbing toward 90 degrees, but I felt ice cold standing in the circular driveway of the Phoenician Resort. The massive property stretched out before me like something from a luxury magazine, with its towering palm trees and fountains that probably cost more than most people's cars. I had driven my modest Honda Civic here after finishing my shift at Valley Market, still wearing the faint scent of the grocery store's cleaning supplies on my black dress. The dress itself was beautiful, something I'd saved up for over 3 months, but standing here among the Bentleys and Mercedes, pulling up to the valet stand, I felt like I was playing dress-up in someone else's life. I walked through the resort's main entrance, my heels clicking against the polished marble floors that reflected the crystal chandeliers hanging overhead. The lobby was a showcase of Southwest elegance, with massive stone fireplaces and Native American art pieces that probably cost more than I made in a year at the grocery store. Well-dressed guests were already mingling, their conversations a mix of stock market talk and vacation home comparisons that made my stomach tighten with familiar inadequacy. The check-in table was positioned near the entrance to the Sonoran Ballroom, draped in white linens and adorned with the kind of floral arrangements that spelled money in every petal. I approached the young woman behind the table, her hair pulled back in a perfect chignon that probably took an hour to create. She wore a nameplate that read Victoria Hayes, Wedding Coordinator, and her smile was professionally warm but clearly reserved for people who belonged in spaces like this. "Good evening," I said, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "I'm Jessica Williams, here for the Williams-Torres wedding." The irony of sharing the groom's last name while feeling like a complete outsider wasn't lost on me. Victoria's perfectly manicured fingers flew across her tablet, her brow furrowing slightly as she scrolled through what seemed like an endless guest list. "I'm sorry, could you spell that for me?" she asked, her tone still polite but with a hint of confusion creeping in. I spelled out my name slowly, watching her search again, this time with more deliberation. The seconds stretched out like hours as other guests flowed around us, their laughter and animated conversations creating a backdrop that made the silence at the check-in table feel deafening. "Miss Williams," Victoria finally said, her voice carefully modulated, "I'm not seeing your name on our guest list. Are you perhaps a +1 for another guest?" The question hung in the air between us, and I felt the heat of embarrassment creep up my neck despite the resort's aggressive air conditioning. A +1? At my own brother's wedding? "No, I'm the groom's sister," I replied, my voice steady even though my hands were starting to shake slightly. "There must be some kind of mistake." Victoria's eyes widened slightly, clearly not expecting this complication. She glanced around nervously, probably wondering how to handle a family member who wasn't on the list without causing a scene that might disrupt the elegant atmosphere her team had worked so hard to create. "Let me just double-check with our event manager," she said, reaching for her phone. But before she could dial, I was already pulling out my own phone, my fingers moving automatically to Mike's contact. If this was a mistake, he'd want to know. If it wasn't, well, I needed to hear it directly from him. The phone rang twice before his familiar voice came through, though it sounded different somehow, more polished and formal than the brother I'd grown up with. "Jess, what's going on? I'm about to start taking pictures." In the background I could hear the sounds of celebration, laughter and music that seemed to emphasize how far away I was from whatever was happening in there. "Mike, I'm at the check-in table, and they're saying I'm not on the guest list, I said, keeping my voice low to avoid drawing attention from the other guests who were still streaming past us. Is there some kind of mix-up with the invitations? I was giving him every opportunity to fix this, to laugh and say of course it was a mistake, that his sister would naturally be at his wedding. The pause that followed was long enough for me to count my own heartbeats. When Mike finally spoke, his voice had changed completely, taking on a tone I'd never heard from him before. It was dismissive, almost cruel, and carried the weight of a decision that had clearly been made long before this phone call. "Come on, Jess. You really thought you'd be invited to this?" The words hit me like a physical blow, each one carefully chosen to maximize impact. "This is a serious event. We've got CEOs here, venture capitalists, people who are actually important in the business world. You work at a grocery store, for crying out loud. Do you have any idea how awkward it would be to introduce you to these people?" I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles going white as his words continued to pour through the speaker. I mean, what would I even say? "Hey, meet my sister, she's a cashier at Valley Market." These people would think I was joking. "Amanda's parents are here, investors from her dad's firm, and my business partners who I'm hoping will fund my next venture. This isn't family game night, Jess, this is my future." The casual cruelty in his voice was what hurt the most. This wasn't anger or frustration, this was calculated dismissal, like he'd thought through exactly why I didn't belong in his new life and had come to peace with it. Around me, the resort's lobby continued its elegant dance of wealthy guests and attentive staff, but I felt like I was standing in a bubble of humiliation that separated me from their effortless confidence. "I understand," I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange and distant even to my own ears. Mike was already moving on, his attention clearly divided between our conversation and whatever important wedding activities were demanding his presence. "Look, I've got to go," he said, and I could hear someone calling his name in the background. "Maybe we can grab coffee next week or something, but tonight, this just isn't the right fit, you know?" The line went dead before I could respond, leaving me standing there with the phone still pressed to my ear like I was hoping for some different ending to replay itself. Victoria was watching me with a mixture of professional sympathy and personal discomfort, clearly having overheard enough of the conversation to understand what had just happened. "I'm so sorry," she said softly, and her kindness somehow made the whole situation worse. "Is there anything I can do?" I looked past her toward the ballroom doors, where I could see glimpses of golden light and hear the gentle sound of a string quartet warming up. Somewhere in there, my brother was celebrating the biggest day of his life, surrounded by people he deemed worthy of.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Sharing it with. And I was out here, dressed in my carefully chosen dress, being treated like an uninvited stranger who had somehow wandered into the wrong event. But as I stood there, processing the magnitude of what had just happened, my hand instinctively moved to the small clutch purse I was carrying. Inside was an envelope I'd been planning to give Mike during the reception, something I'd spent weeks preparing as a wedding gift. It wasn't just a card or a check, it was something that would have changed his entire future, solved problems he didn't even know I was aware of, and set him up for the kind of success he'd always dreamed about. Now, standing in this marble lobby while security guards began to glance in my direction with the kind of polite attention that suggested my time as a non-guest was running out, I realized that envelope was going to serve a very different purpose than I'd originally intended. Mike thought he knew exactly who I was and what I was worth. He thought he understood the limits of my world and the insignificance of my contribution to his life. What he didn't know was that 3 blocks away, in the heart of Phoenix's business district, there was a 30-story glass building with Williams Tech Solutions etched into the granite at its base. He didn't know that the business cards in my wallet identified me as the founder and CEO of a company that had revolutionized supply chain management software for major retailers across the Southwest. He didn't know that my grocery store job was actually me conducting field research, understanding the industry I was transforming from the ground up. Most importantly, he didn't know that the wedding gift in my purse was a contract that would have made his struggling startup the exclusive partner for Williams Tech Solutions' expansion into e-commerce platforms, a deal worth more than he'd probably see in his entire career. But as I stood there, feeling the weight of his dismissal and the curious stares of guests who clearly wondered why someone was loitering near the check-in table, I realized that Mike had just made a choice that would define both of our futures. I walked back to Victoria's table with newfound purpose, my steps more confident than they'd been since I'd entered the resort. "Excuse me," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I have something that needs to be delivered to the groom during the evening. Could you make sure he receives this during the reception?" I handed her the envelope, which was sealed and addressed simply to Mike Williams in my careful handwriting. Victoria accepted the envelope with professional efficiency, probably assuming it was a card from a family member who couldn't attend. "Of course," she said, "I'll make sure this gets to him during the appropriate time." She had no way of knowing that she was holding something that would completely destroy the perfect evening Mike had worked so hard to orchestrate, or that the grocery store girl who had just been turned away from his wedding was about to change his life in ways he never could have imagined. As I walked back through the resort's lobby, past the fountains and the palm trees and the effortless luxury that Mike thought defined success, I pulled out my phone to call Ryan. He'd been waiting at Desert Moon Cafe, a quiet little place downtown where we'd agreed to meet after the reception. Now our evening was starting much earlier than planned, and the conversation we were about to have would be very different from what either of us had expected. The Phoenix skyline glittered ahead of me as I drove away from the Phoenician, and somewhere in that collection of lights was the building that bore my name, the company I'd built from nothing, and the life I'd created while my family assumed I was going nowhere. Mike had made his choice about who belonged in his world and who didn't. Now it was time for him to live with the consequences of that decision, and for me to finally stop hiding who I really was. The drive to Desert Moon Cafe felt like moving through a different world entirely. 20 minutes earlier, I'd been standing in the opulent lobby of the Phoenician, surrounded by marble and crystal and the kind of wealth that announces itself in whispers. Now I was navigating the familiar streets of downtown Phoenix, where the buildings were older and the atmosphere was honest in a way that luxury resorts never quite managed. The cafe sat on the corner of 2nd Street and Van Buren, a modest place with exposed brick walls and mismatched furniture that had become my sanctuary over the past few months. Ryan was already there when I arrived, sitting at our usual table near the window that overlooked the modest street traffic. He looked up as I entered, his expression immediately shifting from casual anticipation to concern as he read the tension in my shoulders and the tightness around my eyes. Without saying a word, he stood and pulled out my chair, a small gesture that somehow managed to anchor me in the moment and remind me that not everyone in my life saw me as disposable. "That was quick," he said gently, settling back into his seat across from me. "How was the check-in?" The question was innocent enough, but something in his tone suggested he already suspected the evening hadn't gone according to plan. Ryan had always been remarkably good at reading the subtle changes in my mood, probably because he was one of the few people who'd bothered to pay attention long enough to learn the signs. I accepted the cup of coffee he'd ordered for me, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic and letting the familiar ritual of caffeine and comfort wash over me before attempting to explain what had just transpired. The cafe buzzed quietly around us with the kind of low-key energy that comes from people who work real jobs and don't feel the need to announce their importance to every stranger within earshot. "I never made it past the lobby," I said finally, watching his eyebrows raise slightly in surprise. Apparently, I wasn't on the guest list. And when I called Mike to clarify, he made it very clear that the omission was intentional. Ryan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he waited for me to continue rather than jumping in with immediate outrage. It was one of the things I appreciated most about him. He understood that sometimes you needed to tell the whole story before you could process what it meant. I recounted the phone call in detail, including Mike's casual dismissal of my career and his obvious embarrassment at the thought of introducing his grocery store sister to his important guests. With each word, I watched Ryan's expression grow darker, though he maintained the kind of controlled composure that came from years of dealing with difficult people in his own line of work. "So he actually said you'd be too awkward to introduce to his business partners?" Ryan repeated slowly, as if testing the words to make sure he'd heard them correctly. "Because you work at Valley Market." There was something dangerous in his tone, the kind of quiet anger that was far more intimidating than shouting or dramatic gestures. "That's the gist of it," I confirmed, taking a sip of coffee and feeling some of the evening's tension begin to ease. "Apparently my employment status doesn't meet the standards for his new social circle. Amanda's parents were there, potential investors, people who matter in ways that I apparently don't." The words still stung to repeat, but sharing them with Ryan somehow diminished their power to hurt me. Ryan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his dark hair in the way he always did when he was processing something particularly frustrating. "Jessica," he said carefully, "you realize how insane this is, right? I mean, setting aside the fact that he's your brother and should want you there regardless of anything else, he has no idea what he's actually rejecting." That was the heart of it, wasn't it? Mike's dismissal wasn't just cruel, it was monumentally ignorant. He'd made assumptions about my life and my worth based on the most superficial possible understanding of who I was and what I did. The grocery store job that he found so embarrassing was actually research, a hands-on education in the industry I was revolutionizing. Every day I spent scanning barcodes and restocking shelves was another day of understanding the pain points that my software was designed to solve. "He doesn't know," I said simply. "None of them do. As far as my family is concerned, I graduated college with a business degree and then mysteriously decided to waste my life working retail. They think I'm unmotivated, maybe a little lazy, definitely not living up to my potential." The familiar ache of being misunderstood settled in my chest, though it felt different now, less sharp and more like an old wound that was finally ready to heal. Ryan shook his head slowly, still processing the magnitude of the situation. "Your brother just excluded the CEO of Williams Tech Solutions from his wedding because he was embarrassed by her day job. Do you understand how this is going to look when the truth comes out?" There was almost a note of admiration in his voice, as if he was impressed by the sheer scope of Mike's miscalculation. The truth was, I hadn't fully considered the implications yet. For the past 3 years, I'd been living a carefully constructed double life, building a company that was rapidly becoming a major player in the supply chain software industry while maintaining the fiction that I was just another college graduate who'd lost her way. The deception hadn't been malicious, it had started as a way to conduct genuine market research and had evolved into a form of protection against exactly the kind of judgment I'd experienced tonight. Working at Valley Market had given me insights that no amount of MBA coursework could have provided. I understood the frustrations of inventory management, the inefficiencies of traditional ordering systems, and the daily challenges that store managers faced when trying to keep shelves stocked and customers satisfied. That knowledge had informed every line of code in the software that Williams Tech Solutions had developed, creating solutions that actually addressed real problems rather than theoretical ones. More importantly, the grocery store job had provided perfect cover for the long hours and intense focus that building a startup required. When I disappeared for weeks at a time to attend investor meetings or technology conferences, my family assumed I was just being antisocial. When I worked late into the night on code development or business planning, they thought I was watching television or browsing social media. The low expectations that frustrated me so much had also created the space I needed to build something extraordinary. I gave them an envelope. I told Ryan, pulling myself back to the present moment. Asked the wedding coordinator to deliver it during the reception. His eyes lit up with interest, recognizing the deliberate precision in my voice that usually meant I'd made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. "What kind of envelope?" he asked, though something in his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. Ryan had been with me through enough business dealings to recognize when I was moving from reaction to strategy, and he understood that my apparent calm often preceded dramatic action. I reached into my purse and pulled out a copy of the document I'd sealed in the envelope I'd left at the Phoenician. Ryan's eyes widened as he scanned the letterhead of Williams Tech Solutions and the formal business language that outlined a partnership proposal worth more than most people saw in a lifetime. The document represented months of planning and research, a carefully constructed offer that would have positioned Mike's struggling startup as the exclusive e-commerce partner for my company's retail expansion. "This was going to be your wedding gift," Ryan said, his voice filled with a mixture of amazement and something that might have been respect. "You were going to hand him a multi-million-dollar partnership deal as a surprise." He looked up from the papers with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between admiration and concern. "That was the plan," I confirmed. "His startup has been hemorrhaging money for the past 8 months. I've been watching from a distance, seeing him struggle with cash flow and investor confidence, knowing I could solve all his problems with a single contract. I thought maybe if I could help him succeed, really succeed, it might change how he saw me. How all of them saw me." The admission felt raw and vulnerable in a way that surprised me. I'd spent so long focusing on building my company and protecting my secrets that I hadn't fully acknowledged how much I still craved my family's approval. Despite all evidence to the contrary, some part of me had continued to believe that if I could just prove myself successful enough, smart enough, valuable enough, they would finally see me as more than a disappointment. Ryan set the papers down carefully, his expression thoughtful. "But now?" he asked, though we both knew the answer had changed fundamentally in the past hour. The gift that had been intended as a bridge between my hidden success and my family's expectations had transformed into something else entirely. "Now he's going to read this and realize exactly what he threw away tonight," I said, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me. "He's going to understand that the sister he was too embarrassed to introduce to his business partners was actually someone who could have saved his entire company. And he's going to have to live with that knowledge." The weight of the decision felt substantial but not burdensome. For years I'd been contorting myself to fit into spaces that were never designed for me, trying to earn recognition from people who had already decided I wasn't worth their attention. Tonight had crystallized something I'd been reluctant to admit. I was tired of hiding who I was to make other people comfortable with their assumptions about who I should be. Ryan reached across the table and took my hand, his fingers warm and steady against mine. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "Once he opens that envelope, there's no going back. Your cover is blown, and everything changes." His concern was genuine, born from his understanding of how carefully I'd guarded my privacy and how much I'd sacrificed to maintain the separation between my public and private lives. I thought about Mike's voice on the phone, the casual cruelty with which he'd dismissed not just my presence at his wedding but my entire worth as a human being. I thought about years of family dinners where my achievements were ignored and my choices were questioned, where success was measured only in terms that my family understood and valued. I thought about the envelope sitting in the wedding coordinator's careful hands, waiting to be delivered during what Mike undoubtedly expected to be the perfect culmination of his perfect evening. "I'm sure," I said, and meant it completely. He made his choice about what I'm worth. Now he gets to live with the consequences. The freedom in that statement was intoxicating, like finally exhaling after holding my breath for years. I was done apologizing for who I was, done minimizing my accomplishments to make other people feel comfortable, done accepting treatment that I would never tolerate from strangers just because it came from family. The cafe around us continued its quiet evening rhythm, oblivious to the small revolution happening at table 12. Through the window I could see the Phoenix skyline beginning to light up as the sun set behind the mountains, and somewhere in that collection of buildings was the company I'd built, the employees who depended on me, and the clients who valued my work enough to pay handsomely for it. That was my real world, not the carefully orchestrated performance of wealth and status happening 3 miles away at the Phoenician. Ryan squeezed my hand gently, anchoring me in the moment. "So what happens now?" he asked, and I realized that for the first time in years I had no idea what came next. The careful balance I'd maintained between my two lives was about to collapse entirely, and everything that followed would be uncharted territory. "Now we wait," I said, feeling a smile tug at the corners of my mouth for the first time all evening. "And we see how long it takes for my phone to start ringing." The anticipation was almost exciting, like standing at the edge of a cliff and finally deciding to jump. Whatever happened next, at least it would be honest. Ryan's phone buzzed against the table and he glanced at the screen before showing it to me. It was a text from his friend Derek, who worked in event photography and was covering several weddings that weekend. "The Phoenician is buzzing tonight," the message read. "Some drama at the Williams-Torres reception. Groom looks like he's seen a ghost." I felt a flutter of satisfaction mixed with nervousness. The envelope had been delivered, which meant Mike had opened it during what should have been one of the happiest moments of his life. Somewhere across town, my brother was processing the magnitude of his miscalculation while surrounded by the very people he'd been so desperate to impress. The thought of his perfect evening crumbling in real time should have felt cruel, but instead, it felt like justice. "Part of me feels bad," I admitted to Ryan, though even as I said it I knew it wasn't entirely true. "He's my brother and this is his wedding day. No one deserves to have their wedding ruined." The words sounded hollow even to my own ears, a reflexive attempt at magnanimity that didn't match the cold satisfaction I actually felt. Ryan raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "Jessica, he literally told you that introducing you to his guests would be too embarrassing. He excluded his own sister from his wedding because he thought your job wasn't impressive enough. Whatever's happening at that reception right now, he brought it on himself." The truth of that statement settled over me like a warm blanket. Mike hadn't been protecting me or trying to spare my feelings. He'd been protecting himself from the imagined embarrassment of having a grocery store worker in his social circle. The cruelty had been casual and calculated, which somehow made it worse than if it had been born from anger or frustration. He'd simply decided I wasn't good enough for his new life, and he'd been comfortable enough with that decision to say it out loud. My phone, which had been mercifully quiet since the disaster at the resort, suddenly lit up with an incoming call. Mike's name flashed on the screen, and I felt my heart rate spike despite my attempts at emotional distance. Ryan noticed immediately, his attention sharpening as he waited to see how I would handle this first contact since the envelope had been delivered. I let the call go to voicemail, watching the screen until it went dark again. Almost immediately, it lit up with another call from the same number. Then another. By the fourth attempt, Ryan was leaning forward with concern, clearly wondering if I should at least answer to find out what was happening. "Not yet," I said, declining the fifth call in as many minutes. "He can wait." The small act of refusing to immediately respond to his sudden urgency felt powerfully satisfying after years of being dismissed whenever it was convenient for him. If Mike had something to say, he could find a way to say it that didn't involve interrupting my evening with his panic. The calls continued sporadically over the next hour as Ryan and I sat in the cafe talking through the implications of what had just happened and what might come next. Each time Mike's name appeared on my screen, I felt a small thrill of control, knowing that for once in our relationship I held all the power and he was the one desperately seeking my attention. By the time we decided to leave Desert Moon Cafe, my phone showed 17 missed calls from Mike, 3 from my mother, and 1 from Amanda. The voicemail notifications had piled up like digital evidence of a world that was rapidly reorganizing itself around a truth that had been hidden for too long. Whatever those messages contained, they represented the beginning of a conversation that would fundamentally change every relationship in my family. As we walked to our cars, Ryan paused beside my Honda Civic, his expression serious. "Are you ready for what comes next?" he asked. Because once you listen to those voicemails and start returning calls, everything changes. There's no going back to the way things were. I looked up at the Phoenix skyline, where the lights of my building were clearly visible among the downtown towers. Somewhere in that structure was an office with my name on the door, a company that bore my vision, and a future that I'd built entirely on my own terms. The life I'd been living in secret was about to become public knowledge, and all the careful boundaries I'd maintained were about to collapse. "I'm ready," I said, and realized I meant it completely. The grocery store girl who'd been turned away from her brother's wedding was about to disappear forever, and in her place would be someone who no longer needed anyone's permission to exist in the world she'd created for herself. The drive home from Desert Moon Cafe gave me time to think about how this pattern had started, how years of small dismissals had built into the monument of disrespect I'd experienced tonight. It wasn't just Mike who had learned to see me as lesser, it was a family tradition that had been carefully cultivated over decades of Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings where my accomplishments were treated as curiosities and my choices were questioned with the kind of condescending concern usually reserved for teenagers making poor decisions. My parents had established the template early. Dad worked as a regional manager for a construction company, solid middle management work that paid well and commanded respect in our suburban Phoenix neighborhood. Mom had been a real estate agent before retiring, the kind of woman who understood the value of appearances and social positioning in ways that shaped every family interaction. They'd raised Mike and me with clear expectations about success, though those expectations had always been more flexible when applied to their golden child. Mike had embraced their vision completely, pursuing business school with the kind of focused ambition that made family gatherings feel like progress reports on his inevitable rise to prominence. Even his choice to start his own company rather than climb the corporate ladder had been celebrated as entrepreneurial vision, evidence of the Williams family's natural business acumen. Every setback was temporary, every challenge was character building, and every small victory was proof that bigger things were coming. My path had been different from the beginning, though I'd tried to hide that fact for as long as possible. While Mike was networking his way through business school, I'd been falling in love with the elegant logic of software development and the infinite possibilities of technology solutions. My business degree had been a compromise with family expectations, but my real education had happened in computer labs and coding boot camps that my parents never bothered to ask about. The first signs of trouble had appeared during my senior year of college when I'd tried to explain my interest in technology during one of our regular family dinners. Dad had listened with the kind of polite attention he usually reserved for Mom's gardening updates, while Mom had immediately begun suggesting ways I could use my business degree more traditionally. Mike, already graduated and working his first corporate job, had offered to introduce me to people in his network who could help me find something more suitable. Technology is fine as a hobby, Mom had said, refilling my water glass with the efficient movements of someone who'd been managing family meals for decades. But you need to think about your future, Jessica. What about marketing? You're good with people, and every company needs marketing. The suggestion had been delivered with the kind of maternal authority that was difficult to argue with, especially when it came wrapped in genuine concern for my well-being. Dad had nodded along, adding his own perspective with the measured tone he used for dispensing fatherly wisdom. Your mother's right, Jess. Technology changes too fast to build a career on. You need something stable, something that will still matter in 20 years. The irony of receiving career advice from people whose understanding of technology hadn't evolved past using email wasn't lost on me, but pointing that out would have been seen as disrespectful rather than factual. Mike had been more direct in his dismissal, though no less wrong in his assessment. Come on, Jess, you're not really a tech person. You like computers, but that's not the same thing as being able to build a business around them. Leave that to the people who actually understand how the industry works. His confidence had been absolute, delivered with the kind of casual certainty that made questioning him feel futile. I'd tried to explain that technology wasn't just about liking computers, that the business applications were vast and growing, that entire industries were being transformed by software solutions that didn't exist yet. But my explanations had been met with the kind of patient smiles that adults give to children who are enthusiastic about something they don't really understand. My family had already decided what I was capable of, and my actual interests didn't factor into their calculations. The pattern had continued after graduation, when I'd moved back to Phoenix and started working at Valley Market while secretly developing the software that would eventually become Williams Tech Solutions. My family had interpreted the grocery store job as evidence that I'd been right about my limitations, that my brief flirtation with technology had predictably led nowhere, and that I was finally accepting reality about my place in the world. It's good that you're working, Mom had said during one particularly painful family dinner, but you can't stay at that level forever. What's your plan for moving up? Have you thought about applying for management positions? Her questions had been well-intentioned but based on the assumption that my current situation was the result of limited options rather than deliberate choice. Dad's approach had been more subtle but equally frustrating. He'd begun including career advice in our conversations, sharing stories from his own professional experience that were meant to guide me toward better decisions. The key is consistency, Jess, he'd told me over coffee during one of our monthly father-daughter breakfasts. Employers want to see that you can stick with something, build experience, show growth. This grocery store thing is fine for now, but you need to start thinking about your next move. The worst part hadn't been their lack of faith in my choices, it had been their complete disinterest in understanding what I was actually doing. When I'd tried to explain that I was learning about supply chain management and inventory systems, they'd heard excuses for why I was still working retail. When I'd mentioned that I was developing software solutions for the problems I was observing, they'd assumed I meant playing around with spreadsheets or maybe taking online courses that wouldn't lead anywhere practical. Mike had been the most dismissive, perhaps because my apparent failure made his own success look more impressive by comparison. During family gatherings, he dominated conversations with updates about his corporate achievements, while I'd been relegated to polite questions about whether I was still enjoying my job at the store. The implication had always been clear: his work mattered in ways that mine never could, and everyone at the table understood that distinction. Jessica's still figuring things out, he'd said during my 26th birthday dinner, his tone carrying just enough condescension to make the statement sting. Not everyone finds their calling right away. Some people need more time to discover what they're really good at. The comment had been delivered with a smile, as if he were being supportive rather than dismissive, but the underlying message had been unmistakable. The family's attitude had crystallized around the idea that I was a late bloomer at best, someone who needed patience and gentle guidance to eventually find my proper place in the world. My college degree proved I wasn't unintelligent, but my career choices suggested I lacked the ambition and focus necessary for real success. They'd been waiting for me to outgrow my current phase and embrace something more appropriate to my education and family background. What they'd never bothered to discover was that their patient disappointment had been building steam for something extraordinary. While they'd been having polite conversations about my need to find direction, I'd been creating a company from scratch, developing software that solved real problems for real businesses, and building a client base that was willing to pay substantial money for solutions they couldn't find anywhere else. The grocery store job that embarrassed them so much had been my laboratory, a place where I could observe the daily frustrations that traditional inventory management created for both employees and customers. Every hour I'd spent scanning barcodes and restocking shelves had informed my understanding of how retail systems actually functioned, knowledge that no amount of theoretical study could have provided. My software didn't just work on paper, it worked in the real world because I'd spent months understanding the real world from the ground up. When store managers complained about ordering systems that didn't account for seasonal variations or customer preferences, I'd been there to hear those complaints directly. When inventory arrived late or in wrong quantities, I'd been part of the team that had to figure out how to make things work anyway. That hands-on experience had made Williams Tech Solutions different from other software companies that developed retail solutions. Our products addressed actual pain points rather than theoretical problems, and our implementation process accounted for the human factors that other developers ignored. The grocery store job that my family saw as evidence of my limited ambition had actually been the foundation for everything I'd built since. But explaining that to people who'd already decided what my life meant would have required them to fundamentally reconsider their assumptions about success, work, and the relationship between education and achievement. It was easier for them to maintain their narrative about my need for guidance than to acknowledge that I might be pursuing something they didn't understand. The irony was that Mike's dismissal tonight hadn't been a departure from family tradition, it had been the logical culmination of years of systematic underestimation. He'd grown up watching our parents treat my choices as evidence of confusion rather than conviction, and he'd learned to see my apparent lack of conventional achievement as proof that I didn't belong in serious conversations about business or success. What he'd never considered was that his own understanding of business success might be limited, that his network of investors and entrepreneurs might not represent the only path to building something meaningful. His startup, which he'd been so proud to discuss during family dinners, was struggling precisely because it was built on theoretical understanding rather than practical experience. He'd identified a market opportunity and developed a solution, but he'd never worked in the trenches to understand how that market actually functioned. The partnership offer I'd prepared for him would have solved that problem completely. Williams Tech Solutions had the industry knowledge, client relationships, and technical infrastructure to make his e-commerce platform viable, profitable, and scalable. The deal would have positioned his company as the exclusive partner for our expansion into new markets, guaranteeing him the kind of success he'd been chasing since graduation. More importantly, it would have validated his belief in his own vision while demonstrating that his family connections were valuable in ways he'd never imagined. Instead of being embarrassed by his grocery store sister, he could have been proud of the sibling who'd been quietly building the exact kind of technology empire he'd always dreamed about creating. But that opportunity had required him to see me as someone worth knowing rather than someone worth hiding, and tonight had proven that he wasn't capable of making that shift. His world was built on appearances and assumptions, and my actual accomplishments didn't fit the story he'd been telling himself about our relative worth. As I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex, a modest place that reflected my commitment to reinvesting profits into company growth rather than lifestyle inflation, I realized that Mike's rejection had actually freed me from something I hadn't understood I was carrying. For years I'd been hoping that my success would eventually be dramatic enough to force my family's recognition, that some achievement would be too big for them to ignore or dismiss. Tonight had shown me that no amount of success would change their fundamental assumptions about who I was and what I was capable of. Mike had been presented with evidence that his sister was exactly the kind of business leader he claimed to admire, and his immediate response had been to exclude her from his celebration. The problem wasn't my lack of achievement, it was their inability to see achievement that didn't match their preconceptions. Walking up the stairs to my apartment, I felt lighter than I had in months. The envelope sitting at the Phoenician represented more than just a business opportunity that Mike had unknowingly rejected, it represented my decision to stop seeking validation from people who'd already decided I wasn't worth their attention. Whatever happened when he opened that envelope, at least it would be honest. My phone buzzed with another call from Mike as I unlocked my apartment door. This time, instead of declining immediately, I watched his name flash on the screen until the call went to voicemail. The difference was subtle but significant. I wasn't avoiding his calls out of hurt or anger anymore. I was simply choosing when and how to engage with someone who'd lost the right to demand my immediate attention. The apartment I entered was a reflection of my double life, furnished simply but comfortably, with a high-end computer setup that looked somewhat out of place among the budget furniture I'd chosen to maintain my cover story. My neighbors knew me as Jessica, the grocery store worker who kept quiet hours and paid her rent on time. They had no idea that the woman in apartment 247 was running a multi-million-dollar technology company from the converted bedroom that served as her home office. Looking around the space, I realized that this careful separation between my public and private lives was about to end completely. Mike's reaction to the envelope would inevitably involve other family members, and the story of Jessica Williams, the grocery store worker, would be replaced by Jessica Williams, the technology entrepreneur. The simplicity of my current life was about to be replaced by complications I'd been avoiding for years. But as I settled into my favorite chair and finally opened my phone to listen to the accumulating voicemails, I felt ready for those complications. The woman who'd been turned away from her brother's wedding for being too embarrassing to introduce to his important guests was about to become someone those same guests would want to meet. The transformation wouldn't be dramatic or sudden, it would simply be the revelation of who I'd been all along. The first voicemail was from Mike, his voice tight with something that might have been panic. "Jess, I just opened your envelope. We need to talk. This can't be real. Call me back immediately. The desperation in his tone was almost satisfying, though it was quickly followed by a more complex emotion that felt uncomfortably like pity. He'd spent his entire evening celebrating what he thought was the pinnacle of his success, only to discover that his embarrassing sister could have handed him more success than he'd ever dreamed possible. The second message was longer, his voice more frantic as the implications had apparently begun to sink in. Jessica, I'm reading this contract and I don't understand. Williams Tech Solutions, you're the CEO, this has to be some kind of mistake. Amanda thinks you're playing a prank, but this looks real. The letterhead, the legal language, everything. Please call me back, I'm freaking out here. By the fourth voicemail, his tone had shifted from confusion to something approaching grief. I messed up, didn't I? I really messed up. Jess, if this is real, if you really run this company, then what I said tonight, God, what I said tonight was horrible. I need to fix this. Please let me fix this. Whatever it takes, I'll make this right. But as I listened to his increasingly desperate messages, I realized that some things couldn't be fixed with apologies or promises. Mike hadn't just made a mistake, he'd revealed something fundamental about how he saw me and how he valued family relationships when they conflicted with his social ambitions. The cruelty hadn't been accidental, it had been calculated, based on his assessment of what I was worth compared to the impression he wanted to make on his guests. The partnership offer in that envelope represented more than just business opportunity, it represented 3 years of watching my brother struggle with his startup, while knowing I could solve all his problems with a single conversation. I'd been waiting for the right moment to reveal my success, hoping it could bring us closer together rather than driving us further apart. Tonight had shown me that no amount of success would bridge a gap that was built on fundamental disrespect. As I set my phone aside and prepared for bed, I realized that tomorrow would be the first day of a very different life. The grocery store job that had provided perfect cover for building my company would have to end, not because I was ashamed of the work but because maintaining the deception was no longer possible or necessary. The family relationships that had been built on their assumptions about my limitations would have to be rebuilt on the truth about my actual accomplishments, if they could be rebuilt at all. Most importantly, the woman who'd spent years hiding her light to avoid challenging other people's expectations was about to step fully into the success she'd been building in secret. The business cards in my wallet that identified me as the founder and CEO of Williams Tech Solutions were about to become public knowledge, and everything that followed would be uncharted territory. But as I turned off the lights and listened to the familiar sounds of Phoenix settling into evening quiet, I felt more at peace than I had in years. Mike's rejection had been cruel, but it had also been clarifying. I was done apologizing for who I was, done minimizing my accomplishments to make other people comfortable, and done accepting treatment that I would never tolerate from strangers just because it came from family. Tomorrow Jessica Williams, the grocery store worker, would cease to exist, and Jessica Williams, the technology entrepreneur, would take her rightful place in the world she'd been building all along. The transformation wouldn't change who I was fundamentally, but it would change how I allowed myself to be seen and treated by everyone around me, and that change, long overdue, felt like the beginning of everything. The next morning arrived with the kind of blazing Arizona sunshine that made Phoenix feel like a city of endless possibilities. I woke up feeling different, as if something fundamental had shifted during the night while I slept. The familiar weight of maintaining my double life was gone, replaced by a clarity that made even the simple act of making coffee feel like a deliberate choice rather than an automatic routine. Today was the day I stopped being two different people and started being entirely myself, regardless of who was comfortable with that transformation. My phone showed 43 missed calls from various family members, a digital avalanche that had started around midnight and continued sporadically until dawn. The voicemail notifications had piled up like evidence of a world reorganizing itself around a truth that could no longer be hidden. I scrolled through the call log while sipping my coffee, noting the progression from Mike's initial panic to my mother's confused concern to what appeared to be a middle-of-the-night conference call between various relatives trying to make sense of what they'd learned. The first order of business was calling in to Valley Market. My manager Sandra Torres was a practical woman in her 50s who'd been running the grocery store for nearly a decade with the kind of efficient competence that made even challenging days feel manageable. She picked up on the second ring, her voice carrying the slight edge that meant she was already dealing with the morning rush of vendors and early customers. "Jessica, please tell me you're not calling in sick," she said without preamble. "Tommy's out with his back injury and we've got that corporate inspection this afternoon." Her assumption that I was looking for a sick day was reasonable given my track record as a reliable employee, but today's conversation was going to be unlike any we'd ever had. "Actually, Sandra, I need to give you my 2 weeks' notice," I said, the words feeling strange and final as they left my mouth. "Something's come up in my personal life that's going to require me to step away from retail." The euphemism felt inadequate for the magnitude of what was actually happening, but explaining that I was quitting my cover job to run my multi-million-dollar technology company full-time seemed like information that deserved a more gradual revelation. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. When Sandra finally spoke, her voice carried a mixture of disappointment and maternal concern that made me realize how much I'd grown to appreciate her steady presence over the past 3 years. "Honey, are you sure about this?" she asked. "I know the pay isn't great, but you've been here longer than most and you're good at what you do. Is this about school? Because we can work around class schedules if you're thinking about going back to college." Her willingness to accommodate what she assumed were my limitations reminded me of how many people had formed genuine relationships with the version of me that was about to disappear forever. "It's not about school," I assured her. "It's actually about a business opportunity that I can't pass up. I've really valued working here, Sandra. You've been an amazing manager and this team has taught me more than you probably realize." The truth of that statement was deeper than she could know. The lessons I'd learned at Valley Market had informed every aspect of the software solutions that Williams Tech had developed, making our products more practical and user-friendly than anything our competitors offered. After hanging up with Sandra, I sat in my kitchen and made a decision that would have been unthinkable 24 hours earlier. I pulled up the contact information for the Phoenix Business Journal and dialed the number for their technology reporter, a woman named Catherine Walsh who'd been following the rise of local startups with the kind of thorough journalism that made her articles required reading in the business community. "Catherine Walsh," she answered, her voice crisp and professional despite the early hour. In the background I could hear the familiar sounds of a newsroom coming to life, keyboards clicking and phones ringing as another day of covering Phoenix's business world got underway. "Walsh, this is Jessica Williams, founder and CEO of Williams Tech Solutions," I said, savoring the opportunity to use my real title without qualification or explanation for the first time in years. "I have a story that I think might interest you about the local technology sector and some recent developments in supply chain software applications." The pause that followed was brief but loaded with the kind of professional curiosity that made Catherine Walsh one of the most respected business journalists in the Southwest. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted to the focused attention that sources learned to recognize and appreciate. "Williams Tech Solutions," she repeated slowly, clearly scrolling through her mental database of local companies. "You're the supply chain optimization people. Your software has been making waves with some of the major retailers in the region. I've been trying to get an interview with your leadership team for months, but your communications people keep saying the CEO isn't available for media appearances." "That's because the CEO has been working undercover in the retail industry to better understand the systems she was trying to optimize," I said, feeling a thrill of anticipation at finally being able to tell the truth about my unconventional approach to market research. "I've spent the last 3 years working as a cashier and stock clerk while developing software solutions that address the real-world problems I was observing daily. Today seems like the right time to go public with that story." The silence that followed was longer this time, and I could practically hear Catherine's journalistic instincts recognizing a story that was both compelling and completely unexpected. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the kind of excitement that made it clear this conversation was about to become the highlight of her week. Are you telling me that the CEO of one of Phoenix's fastest-growing tech companies has been working retail jobs as part of an extended research project?" she asked, clearly already formulating the angle that would make this story irresistible to her readers. "How long has this been going on and what prompted you to reveal it now?" 3 years of research, I confirmed, and let's just say that recent family events have made it clear that it's time to stop hiding who I really am. The understatement felt appropriate for a preliminary conversation, though I suspected Catherine's investigative skills would eventually uncover the full story of last night's wedding disaster. We scheduled an interview for later that afternoon, and as I hung up the phone, I realized that the carefully constructed barriers between my public and private lives were about to crumble completely. By tomorrow morning, anyone who cared about Phoenix's business community would know that Jessica Williams, the grocery store worker, and Jessica Williams, the technology entrepreneur, were the same person. The revelation would inevitably reach my family, my neighbors, my co-workers, and anyone else who'd formed opinions about my life based on incomplete information. My phone rang again, displaying my mother's name for what had to be the 20th time since midnight. This time, instead of letting it go to voicemail, I answered on the third ring, bracing myself for a conversation that would be unlike any we'd ever had. "Jessica Marie Williams," she said, using my full name in the tone she'd reserved for serious disciplinary discussions when I was a child. "I have been up all night trying to make sense of what your brother told me. He says you gave him some kind of business proposal at his wedding, something about a technology company. Is this some kind of elaborate joke?" The use of my middle name and the maternal authority in her voice might have intimidated me even a few months ago, but today it simply reminded me of how thoroughly my family had underestimated my capacity for making my own decisions. The woman who'd spent years offering career advice based on the assumption that I lacked direction was about to learn that I'd been building something extraordinary while she was worried about my lack of ambition. "It's not a joke, Mom," I said calmly. "I've been running a technology company for the past 3 years. Williams Tech Solutions specializes in supply chain optimization software for retail businesses. The business proposal Mike received was a partnership offer that would have made his startup the exclusive e-commerce partner for our expansion into new markets." The silence that followed was so complete I wondered if she'd hung up the phone. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller and more uncertain than I'd heard since childhood, when she was the one asking questions instead of providing answers. "But you work at a grocery store," she said, as if stating this obvious fact would somehow resolve the contradiction she was struggling to process. "You scan groceries and stock shelves. I've seen you come home tired from those shifts. How could you be running a company?" "The grocery store job was research," I explained patiently. "I needed to understand how retail operations actually work before I could develop software to improve them. Every day I spent at Valley Market informed the development of solutions that our clients pay substantial money to implement. The work wasn't a sign that I lacked ambition, it was part of building something bigger than anything I could have created from theoretical knowledge alone." I could hear her trying to process this information, the mental reorganization required to reconcile the daughter she thought she knew with the woman I was revealing myself to be. For years, she'd been gently worried about my lack of direction, offering suggestions and advice based on the assumption that I needed guidance to find my way. Learning that I'd been pursuing a clear vision all along, just not one she'd recognized, was clearly challenging everything she'd believed about my capabilities and choices. "Your father and I," she began slowly, "we thought you were struggling. We thought maybe you'd lost confidence after college, that you were afraid to try for something bigger. We've been so worried about you, honey. Why didn't you tell us what you were really doing?" The question contained layers of hurt and confusion that made me realize how my secrecy had affected them as well. They'd been genuinely concerned about my well-being, interpreting my career choices as evidence of problems they wanted to help me solve. Their dismissive attitude toward my work had been based on incomplete information, though that didn't entirely excuse their failure to ask better questions or show more curiosity about my actual experiences. "I tried to tell you," I said gently but firmly. When I talked about supply chain management and inventory systems, when I mentioned software development projects, when I tried to explain what I was learning about retail operations, you heard excuses for why I was still working at the store. You'd already decided what my life meant, and my actual explanations didn't fit that narrative. She was quiet for a long moment, and I could imagine her sitting in her kitchen, probably still in her bathrobe, trying to reconcile her memories of those conversations with what she was learning now. The realization that she'd been dismissing actual accomplishments while worrying about imaginary failures was clearly painful, and I found myself feeling sorry for her despite everything. Mike says the partnership offer was worth millions of dollars, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. He says you were going to give him a contract that would have saved his company and made him wealthy. Is that true? It was going to be my wedding gift to him, I confirmed. I've been watching his startup struggle for months, knowing I could solve all his problems with a single partnership agreement. I thought maybe if I could help him succeed, it might change how our family saw each other. I wanted to use my success to bring us closer together, but you didn't give it to him, she said, and I could hear her beginning to understand the full scope of what had happened at the wedding. What changed your mind? He told me I was too embarrassing to introduce to his important guests, I said simply. He said my grocery store job didn't exactly scream VIP, and that I'd stick out like a sore thumb among the CEOs and investors he wanted to impress. So I realized that my success wouldn't change how he saw me, it would just give him more reason to be embarrassed about the methods I'd used to achieve it. The sharp intake of breath from my mother's end of the line told me she was finally grasping the full tragedy of Mike's miscalculation. Her son had rejected a multi-million-dollar opportunity because he was ashamed of the sister who was offering it, never bothering to learn enough about her life to understand what he was throwing away. "Oh, Jessica," she whispered, and for the first time in our conversation, her voice carried the weight of genuine regret. "What are you going to do now? About the partnership, I mean, and about Mike's company?" "I'm donating the money to charity," I said, feeling the same sense of rightness that had guided me to that decision the night before. Williams Tech Solutions is establishing a foundation to support small businesses owned by women and minorities in the technology sector. The funding that would have saved Mike's company is going to help people who actually appreciate the opportunities they're given. The decision felt like justice and liberation combined, a way to honor my success while ensuring it served people who understood the value of support and recognition. Mike's startup would have to find its own path forward, just as I'd had to build mine without the benefit of family understanding or encouragement. "And what about us?" Mom asked, her voice small and uncertain. "What about our family? How do we move forward from this?" It was the question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The revelation of my true circumstances didn't just change how my family saw me, it changed how I saw them, and it raised fundamental questions about whether relationships built on such complete misunderstanding could be rebuilt on a foundation of truth. "I don't know, Mom," I admitted. "For 3 years you've all been relating to a version of me that doesn't really exist. The daughter you've been worried about, the sister Mike was ashamed of, the family member everyone thought needed guidance and direction. That person was never real. I don't know if you can accept the person I actually am, and I don't know if I can go back to pretending to be someone I'm not just to make family gatherings more comfortable." The conversation ended with promises to talk more later, after everyone had time to process what they'd learned. But as I hung up the phone, I realized that the most important conversations had already happened. Mike's rejection had clarified something that years of family dinners had obscured. I didn't need their approval to be successful, and I didn't need their understanding to be happy. The interview with Catherine Walsh that afternoon was one of the most satisfying professional experiences of my life. For 2 hours I sat in her downtown office and told the complete truth about Williams Tech Solutions, about my unconventional approach to market research, and about the success we'd achieved by building solutions that addressed real problems rather than theoretical ones. Her questions were insightful and challenging, and her obvious respect for what I'd accomplished felt like a stark contrast to the dismissive attitude I'd grown accustomed to from my family. "This is an incredible story," she said as we wrapped up the interview. CEO goes undercover in her own target industry to build better products. It's the kind of hands-on leadership that other tech companies talk about, but rarely actually implement. When can we schedule a follow-up to discuss your expansion plans? The article would run in the next day's business section, with a follow-up feature planned for the weekend edition. By Monday morning, anyone who mattered in Phoenix's business community would know exactly who Jessica Williams really was and what she'd built. The grocery store worker who'd been too embarrassing for her brother's wedding guests would be revealed as exactly the kind of entrepreneur those same guests would want to meet. That evening, Ryan and I celebrated at a restaurant downtown, toasting the end of my double life and the beginning of whatever came next. The view from our table included the downtown skyline, where Williams Tech Solutions occupied 3 floors of a gleaming office tower, and for the first time, I felt comfortable acknowledging that those lights represented my work, my vision, and my success. "How does it feel?" Ryan asked, raising his glass in a toast that encompassed everything that had changed in the past 24 hours. "Being yourself full-time instead of part-time, terrifying and liberating," I admitted, clinking my glass against his. I'd gotten so used to hiding that I'd forgotten how much energy it takes to maintain a false identity. "I feel like I can breathe fully for the first time in years." My phone buzzed with another call from Mike, the latest in a series that had continued throughout the day, as the reality of his situation became clearer. This time, instead of declining the call, I answered it. The conversation that followed was exactly what I'd expected: apologies, explanations, and increasingly desperate attempts to convince me to reconsider the partnership offer. "Jessica, please," he said, his voice carrying the kind of panic that came from watching a lifetime of ambition collapse in real time. "I know I messed up at the wedding. I know what I said was horrible, but we can fix this. You're my sister, and I love you, and I'm sorry I didn't see what you were building. But your company and my company, we could still work together. We could still be a family business." The phrase family business was particularly galling, considering that he'd excluded me from his family celebration less than 24 hours earlier. The sudden recognition of my value felt transparently motivated by self-interest rather than genuine understanding or remorse. "Mike," I said calmly, "yesterday you told me that introducing me to your business partners would be too embarrassing because I work at a grocery store. Today you want to create a family business together. Do you understand why that feels less than sincere?" "But I didn't know," he protested, his voice taking on the whining quality that had annoyed me even when we were children. "If I'd known you were running a tech company, everything would have been different. You can't blame me for reacting to incomplete information." "I can blame you for not bothering to get complete information," I replied. "For 3 years, you've been content to assume the worst about my choices without ever asking questions that might have revealed the truth. You didn't want to know what I was really doing because it was easier to feel superior when you thought I was failing." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Mike cycling through every argument he could think of to convince me to reconsider. He promised to make public apologies, to give me credit for his company's future success, to introduce me to all the important people he'd been so worried about embarrassing himself with. But each promise only reinforced how completely he'd missed the point of what had happened. "The partnership offer wasn't about getting recognition or meeting your friends," I finally told him. "It was about family, about using my success to help someone I cared about. When you rejected me, you weren't just declining my presence at your wedding, you were rejecting the relationship I was trying to build between us. That can't be fixed with apologies or promises." The business article ran the next morning with a headline that made me smile: "Local Tech CEO's Undercover Success: How Jessica Williams Built a $1 Million Company While Working Retail." Catherine Walsh had captured the story perfectly, presenting my unconventional approach as innovative rather than eccentric, and highlighting the practical benefits of my hands-on research methods. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My company email filled with interview requests, partnership proposals, and congratulations from colleagues who'd known me only in my professional capacity. The contrast between this recognition and my family's years of dismissal was striking enough to make me realize how much energy I'd been wasting trying to earn approval from people who were determined not to give it. More satisfying than the professional recognition was the personal freedom that came with finally living as one integrated person instead of maintaining separate identities for different audiences. The careful compartmentalization that had defined my life for 3 years was replaced by a simplicity that made even routine decisions feel more authentic. 6 months later, I stood in the executive conference room of Williams Tech Solutions, looking out over downtown Phoenix, while my leadership team prepared for a presentation to potential investors. The company had grown beyond anything I'd imagined when I was scanning groceries and taking notes on inventory management systems, and the partnership opportunities that were now available made Mike's struggling startup look quaint by comparison. My phone buzzed with a text from Ryan, who was downstairs in the lobby waiting to take me to lunch. We'd been talking about marriage, about building a life together that didn't require either of us to hide who we were or apologize for our successes. The contrast between that kind of relationship and the conditional acceptance I'd received from my family was stark enough to make me grateful for Mike's rejection, which had forced me to stop seeking validation from people who were incapable of providing it. The family relationships that had been damaged by the wedding incident had never fully recovered, though they'd settled into a new equilibrium based on honesty rather than assumption. My parents had gradually come to terms with having a daughter whose success exceeded their understanding, though their pride was still tinged with regret for the years they'd spent worrying about problems that didn't exist. Mike's company had eventually declared bankruptcy, a casualty of his inability to adapt to an industry that rewarded substance over style. But the most important change wasn't in how my family saw me, it was in how I saw myself. The woman who'd once hidden her achievements to avoid challenging other people's expectations had been replaced by someone who understood that her worth wasn't determined by other people's ability to recognize it. The grocery store job that had embarrassed my brother had become a foundational element of a success story that was entirely my own. As I gathered my things to meet Ryan for lunch, I realized that the best revenge against people who underestimate you isn't proving them wrong, it's building something so meaningful that their opinion becomes irrelevant. Mike's wedding had been the beginning of that process, the moment when I'd stopped apologizing for who I was and started celebrating it instead. The building that bore my name was visible from the restaurant where Ryan and I had lunch, a daily reminder that the woman who'd been too embarrassing to introduce to important guests had actually been someone those guests would have been honored to meet. But more than that, it was proof that sometimes the most powerful response to rejection is simply to become so undeniably yourself that hiding becomes impossible. The weeks following the article's publication brought changes that rippled through every aspect of my life in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Walking into Valley Market to work my final shifts felt surreal, like visiting a place that belonged to someone else's history rather than my own present. The employees who'd known me as Quiet Jessica, who always volunteered for inventory shifts, now looked at me with a mixture of awe and confusion, as if I'd transformed into a stranger overnight, despite being the same person who'd restocked shelves alongside them just days earlier. Sandra had taken the news of my true identity with the kind of practical grace that had made her such an effective manager. During my last shift, she pulled me aside near the loading dock where we'd spent countless hours discussing the inefficiencies of the store's ordering system, conversations that had directly informed some of Williams Tech Solutions' most successful product features. "I read the article," she said, leaning against a pallet of canned goods with her arms crossed in the posture I'd come to recognize as her thinking stance. "All this time you were testing your software ideas on us. On me, I kept complaining about the inventory system, and you were taking notes like some kind of corporate spy." Her tone wasn't accusatory, but there was an edge of betrayal that made me realize how my secrecy had affected even the relationships I'd valued most during this period. It wasn't about spying, I tried to explain, searching for words that would convey the genuine respect I'd had for the work and the people I'd worked alongside. I needed to understand the problems from the inside, to experience the frustrations firsthand so I could build solutions that actually worked. Everything you taught me about managing a team, about juggling competing demands, about making systems work even when they're fundamentally broken, all of that went into creating better software. Sandra nodded slowly, her expression softening slightly as she processed my explanation. You know what the crazy thing is? Your software, the stuff your company sells, we're actually looking at implementing it here. Corporate sent down a memo last week about upgrading our inventory management system, and Williams Tech Solutions is one of the finalists. I didn't make the connection until I saw your picture in the paper. The irony was almost too perfect. The grocery store that had unknowingly hosted my research was now considering purchasing the products that research had created. It felt like the universe was confirming that my unconventional approach had been valid all along, that the years of living this double life had produced something genuinely valuable, rather than just serving my own need to prove something to my family. My final day at Valley Market fell on a Saturday, traditionally the busiest day of the week, when the store filled with families doing their weekly shopping, and the checkout lines stretched toward the back of the store. I'd requested to work the register one last time, wanting to end this chapter of my life doing the exact work that my brother had found so embarrassing. Each item I scanned, each customer I smiled at, felt like a small act of defiance against the judgment that had sparked this entire transformation. During my lunch break, I sat in the break room, where I'd spent hundreds of hours over the past 3 years, eating sandwiches and listening to coworkers discuss their lives while I mentally cataloged every complaint about the store's systems. The faded posters about workplace safety and the ancient microwave that only heated things on one side had become oddly familiar, almost comforting in their consistent mediocrity. Leaving this space meant leaving behind a version of myself that had been protected by anonymity and low expectations. Tommy Rodriguez, who'd worked the produce section for as long as anyone could remember, came in during my break and sat down heavily in the plastic chair across from me. His back injury had healed enough for him to return to light duties, and he'd been one of the few coworkers who'd treated me exactly the same after the article came out. "So you're really leaving," he said, unwrapping his own lunch with the deliberate movements of someone whose body reminded him daily not to rush. "Going to be weird not having you around. You were one of the good ones, actually cared about doing the job right even though everyone could tell you were overqualified for it." His observation struck me as particularly insightful. Even while maintaining my cover, I'd apparently been unable to completely hide that this work was temporary for me in ways it wasn't for my coworkers, who depended on these jobs as their primary income. The guilt that accompanied that realization was complicated, tangled up with questions about privilege and authenticity that I wasn't sure I could fully answer. "I learned more here than at any job I've ever had," I told him honestly. "The business degree I spent 4 years earning taught me theories and frameworks, but this place taught me how things actually work, how people actually behave when systems fail them, how much creativity it takes to make broken processes function day after day." Tommy nodded, a small smile crossing his weathered face. "That's the thing about retail that fancy business types never understand. It's not about following the manual. It's about figuring out how to keep everything running when the manual doesn't cover what's actually happening. You got that, which is probably why your software company is doing so well." He paused, then added with characteristic directness, "Also why your brother's an idiot for being embarrassed about you working here." The validation from Tommy, who had no reason to flatter me or tell me what I wanted to hear, meant more than any number of congratulatory messages from professional contacts who were primarily interested in what my success could do for them. He'd seen me at my most ordinary, doing unglamorous work without complaint, and he'd respected the effort even when he had no idea about the broader context. The afternoon shift passed in a blur of familiar tasks, performed with the bittersweet awareness that each action was happening for the last time. Scanning groceries, making small talk with customers, calling for price checks, handling returns, all the minutiae of retail work that had formed the foundation of my understanding about how commerce actually functioned at ground level. When my shift ended and I clocked out for the final time, the simple act of removing my employee badge felt weighted with significance I hadn't expected. Sandra met me at the time clock with an envelope that contained my final paycheck, along with a card signed by the entire staff. Inside, people had written brief messages that ranged from "good luck with your company" to "don't forget about us little people," to Tommy's characteristically succinct "thanks for actually working instead of just pretending." The mix of genuine goodwill and slightly awkward attempts to acknowledge the weirdness of the situation captured perfectly the complexity of relationships built on incomplete truths. "You're welcome back anytime," Sandra said, shaking my hand with formal gravity before pulling me into a quick hug that felt more maternal than professional. "If you ever need someone to tell you that your fancy software is missing something obvious, you know where to find me." Her offer, delivered with a smile, contained an implicit acknowledgement that my time here had been valuable for both of us, that the exchange of knowledge had flowed in multiple directions despite the apparent hierarchy of our positions. Driving away from Valley Market for the last time, I watched the familiar building shrink in my rearview mirror and felt the strange mixture of relief and nostalgia that accompanies any significant ending. That grocery store had been my sanctuary and my laboratory, the place where I could be anonymous while doing meaningful work, where my worth was measured in shifts completed rather than expectations met or disappointed. Leaving it meant fully embracing the identity I'd been building in secret, accepting all the visibility and vulnerability that came with being publicly successful. The transformation of my daily routine happened faster than I'd anticipated. Within a week of leaving Valley Market, my calendar filled with the kinds of commitments that had previously been squeezed into evenings and weekends around my retail schedule. Board meetings, investor presentations, client consultations, media interviews, all the activities that came with running a rapidly growing technology company and being willing to be the public face of that growth. The office space that Williams Tech Solutions occupied had previously felt like a part-time residence, a place I visited between grocery shifts to handle urgent matters before rushing back to my other life. Now it became my primary professional home, and I found myself spending entire days in the corner office that bore my name on the door, making decisions that affected dozens of employees and millions of dollars in contracts, without having to check my watch to see if I needed to leave for an evening shift. My leadership team, who'd grown accustomed to their CEO being mysteriously unavailable during traditional business hours, adjusted to my constant presence with varying degrees of comfort. Jennifer Adams, my chief technology officer, who'd been with the company since its earliest days, seemed relieved to finally have regular access to my input on product development decisions. Thomas Clark, who handled our business operations, admitted during a private conversation that he'd been planning his departure because he'd assumed my frequent absences indicated a lack of serious commitment to the company's growth. "I thought you were one of those dilettante entrepreneurs," he confessed over coffee in my office, his usual corporate reserve cracking slightly. "Rich kid playing at running a business while daddy's money kept everything afloat. Finding out you were working retail to fund your research and living in a modest apartment to reinvest profits completely changed my assessment. You're the real deal, and I'm sorry I doubted that." His admission revealed something I hadn't fully considered, that my secrecy about the grocery store job had created its own set of misperceptions, that people had filled in the gaps in their knowledge about me with assumptions that were often as wrong as my family's had been. Just in different directions. The version of me that my employees had imagined was as incomplete as the version my family had known, and now everyone was adjusting to a more complete picture that didn't match any of their previous assumptions. The media attention that followed Catherine Walsh's initial article created its own challenges and opportunities. other journalists wanted to interview the CEO who'd gone undercover in her own target industry. Business schools asked me to speak about unconventional approaches to market research, and industry conferences extended invitations to present my company's methodology. Each request required me to become more comfortable with public visibility, to step into the role of thought leader and successful entrepreneur, rather than hiding behind the anonymity that had protected me for so long. My first major speaking engagement was at a technology conference in San Diego, where I'd been asked to discuss innovation in supply chain management software. Standing backstage before my presentation, I felt the weight of performing success in a way I'd never had to do while scanning groceries or writing code in my apartment. The audience would include competitors, potential clients, investors, and journalists, all watching to see if the woman who'd built a successful company while working retail could articulate a compelling vision for the future of her industry. Ryan had accompanied me to the conference, and he stood beside me in the wings as I waited for my introduction. His presence had become increasingly important as my public profile grew, a reminder of relationships that existed independent of my professional success or family drama. We'd been talking more seriously about our future together, about what it would mean to build a life with someone who truly understood and valued who I was rather than who they thought I should become. "You've presented to clients and investors dozens of times," he reminded me, seeing the nervousness I was trying to hide. "This is just a bigger room with more people. Same content, same expertise, same you." His confidence in my ability to handle this moment helped calm the anxiety that had been building since I'd accepted the invitation. The presentation itself went better than I'd hoped. I spoke about the disconnect between theoretical business solutions and practical implementation challenges, using specific examples from my time at Valley Market to illustrate how software developers often missed crucial details about user needs. The audience responded with engaged questions and appreciative laughter at my stories about inventory mishaps and system failures, and by the time I left the stage, several people were already approaching to discuss potential partnerships or consulting opportunities. What I hadn't anticipated was the response from other women in the technology sector. During the conference reception, I was approached by at least a dozen female entrepreneurs and executives who wanted to share their own stories of being underestimated, dismissed, or forced to prove themselves in ways their male colleagues never faced. The common thread in their experiences was the exhausting necessity of being twice as good to receive half the recognition, of having their expertise questioned and their achievements attributed to luck or connections rather than skill and hard work. One woman, the founder of a cybersecurity firm that had recently secured major government contracts, pulled me aside for a conversation that felt more like a confession than networking. "I saw the article about your brother's wedding," she said quietly. "About him being ashamed to introduce you to his business contacts. My father did something similar at his retirement party last year. Introduced my brother, who works in sales, as the successful one, while I was standing right there with a company worth 10 times what my brother makes annually." Her story and the dozen others like it that I heard throughout the conference revealed that my experience with Mike wasn't an isolated incident of one person's poor judgment. It was part of a broader pattern of how success was recognized and valued differently depending on who was achieving it and whether their methods matched traditional expectations. The grocery store job that Mike had found so embarrassing was actually just an excuse. The real issue was his inability to imagine that his sister could be more successful than him in ways he'd never anticipated. The validation from these conversations was profound, but it also came with a new sense of responsibility. My story had resonated with people who saw their own struggles reflected in my experience, and they were looking to me not just as a successful entrepreneur but as someone who'd navigated the specific challenges that came with building success while being systematically underestimated. The visibility I'd been avoiding for years suddenly felt like an opportunity to create space for other people's stories and achievements. Flying back to Phoenix after the conference, I found myself thinking about legacy in ways I never had before. Williams Tech Solutions was successful and growing, but its impact was primarily measured in profits and client satisfaction. The real potential for meaningful change lay in using my platform and resources to challenge the assumptions that had made my own journey unnecessarily difficult, to create opportunities for people whose talent was being overlooked because they didn't fit conventional molds. That realization led to the founding of the Williams Foundation, the charitable organization I'd mentioned to my mother during our difficult phone conversation. But instead of just providing funding, the foundation would offer mentorship, networking opportunities, and practical support to entrepreneurs who were building businesses while navigating the kinds of dismissive attitudes I'd experienced from my own family. The irony of using money that could have saved Mike's company to help people he'd probably consider beneath his notice felt like poetic justice. 6 months after the wedding that had sparked this entire transformation, I received an unexpected letter from Mike. It arrived at my office rather than my apartment, suggesting he'd gotten the address from the company website rather than any remaining family connection. The envelope was thick, multiple pages of what I assumed would be either extended apologies or renewed attempts to convince me to reconsider the partnership offer. Instead, the letter was a strange mixture of both, along with something that approximated genuine reflection on what had happened and why. He wrote about the aftermath of his wedding night, how the revelation of my true circumstances had cast a shadow over what should have been the happiest day of his life. He described the uncomfortable conversations with investors who'd read the article about my success and asked pointed questions about why his sister hadn't been at his wedding. He detailed the slow collapse of his company as funding dried up and partners lost confidence in his judgment. But more importantly, he wrote about being forced to reconsider everything he'd believed about success, about family, and about the measures of worth that he'd been using to evaluate not just me but himself. The bankruptcy of his company had apparently triggered some genuine self-examination, though whether that reflection was motivated by actual growth or just the pain of failure was difficult to determine from the careful language of his letter. I understand now that the problem wasn't your job, he wrote in a section that felt more honest than the rest. It was my inability to see past the surface of what you were doing to understand why you were doing it. I thought success looked like my version of it, like the trappings of corporate achievement and impressive job titles. I couldn't imagine that someone working at a grocery store might be building something more substantial than anything I'd ever created. That failure of imagination cost me more than just your partnership offer. It cost me a relationship with someone I should have valued regardless of her career status. The letter concluded with an acknowledgement that he didn't expect forgiveness or reconciliation but hoped that someday we might be able to rebuild some kind of connection based on honesty rather than the toxic dynamics that had defined our previous relationship. He included no specific requests for help or renewed business proposals, which suggested either genuine growth or sophisticated manipulation. Time would reveal which interpretation was more accurate. I read the letter 3 times. Sitting at my desk while the Phoenix sunset painted the sky outside my window in shades of orange and purple that reminded me why I'd chosen to build my life in this city. The anger that had burned so hot on the night of his wedding had cooled over the months into something more like sadness for what our family relationships could have been if built on different foundations. Mike's rejection had freed me from seeking his approval, but it had also revealed the emptiness of victories that came at the cost of meaningful connections. Ryan found me still sitting with the letter when he arrived to take me to dinner, and I handed it to him without explanation. He read through it carefully, his expression thoughtful as he processed Mike's words and tried to gauge my reaction to them. "What are you going to do?" he asked finally, settling into the chair across from my desk with the patient attention that had become one of my favorite things about him. "Are you going to respond?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. Part of me wants to believe that he's genuinely learned something from all this, that losing everything forced him to reconsider his values and priorities. But another part of me wonders if he's just figured out that appearing contrite might eventually lead back to some version of what he lost. Ryan nodded slowly, understanding the complexity of my hesitation. "You don't have to decide right now," he pointed out. "And you don't owe him a response just because he wrote to you. Whatever you choose to do about Mike and your family, it should be based on what's healthy for you, not on some obligation to fix relationships other people broke." His words crystallized something I'd been feeling but hadn't articulated, that the freedom I'd found in walking away from my family's expectations included the freedom to decide if and how to reconnect with them on my own terms. Mike's letter didn't obligate me to forgive him or resume our relationship. It was simply information about his current state of mind, and I could choose what, if anything, to do with that information. The decision about how to respond to Mike, whether to respond at all, became less urgent as other aspects of my life demanded attention. Williams Tech Solutions secured 2 major contracts that would require expanding our team significantly. The foundation launched its first round of grants to aspiring entrepreneurs, and Ryan and I started seriously planning our wedding for the following spring. Each of these developments represented a future that was entirely separate from my family's opinions about my choices, built on foundations that had nothing to do with earning approval from people who'd already proven their inability to recognize my worth. My relationship with my parents had settled into an awkward détente where we maintained periodic contact but avoided discussing the deeper issues that the wedding incident had revealed. Mom still called occasionally, usually with news about other family members or questions about how the business was doing, carefully avoiding topics that might reopen wounds that hadn't fully healed. Dad sent occasional emails about business articles he'd read that reminded him of my work, his way of trying to show interest without having to directly address the years he'd spent being uninterested. The transformation of how they related to me was both validating and frustrating. Their newfound respect for my career felt contingent on my visible success rather than rooted in fundamental trust in my judgment and capabilities. I suspected that if Williams Tech Solutions failed tomorrow, they'd revert to seeing me as the daughter who'd lost her way rather than someone who'd taken calculated risks that sometimes don't pay off. True acceptance would have remained constant regardless of my circumstances, but what they offered was conditional admiration based on outcomes rather than process. Lauren Martinez, my cousin who'd always been an ally within the family, reached out more consistently than anyone else. She'd witnessed the wedding disaster from the inside, watched Mike's perfect evening crumble as he'd read my letter, and observed the family's scrambling attempts to make sense of revelations that contradicted years of accepted narratives. Her perspective offered insights into conversations I hadn't been present for, reactions I hadn't witnessed directly. "Your mom cried for 2 days after reading that article," Lauren told me during one of our regular coffee meetings at Desert Moon Cafe, which had become our designated neutral ground for family discussions. "Not because she was upset about you lying to her, but because she realized how much she'd missed by not paying closer attention to your life. She kept saying, 'How did I not see this? How did I not know my own daughter was building something extraordinary?'" The image of my mother confronting her own role in my years of feeling invisible was simultaneously satisfying and painful. I'd wanted her to see me clearly, to value my work and respect my choices, but I'd never intended to cause her genuine anguish. The complexity of wanting acknowledgement while also not wanting to hurt the people who'd failed to provide it created an emotional tangle I was still working to unknot. "What about Mike?" I asked, partly because I was curious and partly because Lauren's unfiltered observations often revealed truths that direct conversations obscured. "How is he handling everything?" The letter had given me his version of his response, but I wanted to know what he was showing to the rest of the family when he wasn't performing contrition. Lauren's expression grew complicated, a mixture of sympathy and exasperation that suggested her cousin loyalty was being tested by conflicting obligations. "Honestly, he's a mess. The company folding was bad enough, but the way it happened, with everyone knowing about the partnership he turned down, it's like his failure has this additional layer of public humiliation. Amanda's been increasingly distant, and I think their marriage might not survive this." The news about Mike's marriage struggling added another dimension to the consequences of that wedding night. Amanda had been part of the decision to exclude me, had participated in creating the guest list that left out family members who didn't match the image they wanted to project. Now she was experiencing the fallout of choices that had seemed so reasonable when they'd made them, discovering that the man she'd married had judgment problems that extended beyond a single cruel decision. "Do you think I should respond to his letter?" I asked Lauren, valuing her perspective as someone who understood both sides of the family divide. Part of me feels like maintaining distance is healthier, but another part wonders if I'm being unnecessarily harsh by refusing to engage with what might be genuine growth. Lauren considered the question carefully, swirling her coffee while she formulated a response that would be honest without being disloyal to either of us. I think you have to decide what you want from a relationship with Mike, if you want one at all, she finally said. He wrote that letter, but what's he actually offering? Is it a genuine acknowledgement of how he hurt you, or is it positioning for some future benefit? You know him better than I do in some ways. What does your gut tell you? My gut told me that Mike's transformation, if it was real, was still in its early stages and would need to be proven through actions rather than words. The letter had been a start, but years of dismissive treatment couldn't be erased by a few pages of carefully crafted contrition. If he was serious about rebuilding our relationship, he would need to demonstrate through consistent behavior that he'd actually internalized the lessons he claimed to have learned. The decision I ultimately made about Mike's letter was to acknowledge it briefly without committing to anything beyond that initial response. I sent a short email thanking him for his honesty and wishing him well in his future endeavors, deliberately vague about whether I was open to further communication. The message was cordial but distant, maintaining boundaries while not completely slamming the door on potential future reconciliation if he proved through sustained effort that his reflection had been genuine. Ryan and I set our wedding date for April, choosing a venue in Sedona that offered stunning red rock views and a sense of peace that felt appropriate for committing to a future built on honesty and mutual respect. The guest list was deliberately small, limited to people who actually knew us rather than business contacts or social obligations. Lauren would be there, of course, and a handful of college friends who'd remained close despite my years of maintaining distance to protect my secrets. My parents received invitations after considerable deliberation, but Mike and Amanda did not. The decision not to invite my brother to my wedding felt like both justice and sadness combined. On one hand, it was a clear demonstration that exclusion hurt regardless of the justifications offered for it. On the other hand, it represented the acknowledgement that some betrayals created distances too great to cross with a single letter or apology. If Mike had genuinely changed, if he'd truly learned to value people independent of their immediate utility to his ambitions, there would be time in the future to rebuild something. But my wedding day would be reserved for people who'd earned the right to witness my happiness through consistent support rather than convenient timing. Planning the wedding while running an expanding company created its own challenges, but Ryan and I approached both tasks with the kind of practical teamwork that suggested we'd figured out how to build a partnership based on complementary strengths rather than competitive jockeying for position. He handled logistics I found tedious while I made decisions about aesthetics and atmosphere that he was happy to delegate. The ease of our collaboration stood in stark contrast to the family dynamics I'd grown up with, where every interaction seemed to involve subtle competitions and defensive positioning. The foundation's first grant recipients were announced at an event that generated more media attention than I'd anticipated. 20 women and minority entrepreneurs received funding and support to develop their business ideas, each selected based on the strength of their vision rather than their conformity to conventional expectations about what successful founders looked like. The applications had revealed dozens of stories similar to my own, people building extraordinary things while being systematically underestimated by family members, investors, or colleagues who couldn't see past surface appearances. One recipient, a woman named Keisha Washington who was developing educational software while working as a school janitor, reminded me so powerfully of my own journey that I found myself mentoring her personally rather than just providing financial support. Her story of being dismissed by teachers and administrators who saw her only as support staff rather than a potential innovator could have been written by past me before the wedding incident forced everything into the open. They keep asking when I'm going to get a real job, Keisha told me during one of our mentoring sessions, her frustration evident in the tightness around her eyes. Like working with their kids every day, seeing exactly where the educational system fails them isn't real work. They have no idea that I'm building software that could transform how students learn because they've already decided that someone who cleans classrooms can't possibly have valuable insights about education. Her words echoed conversations I'd had with myself during my years at Valley Market, the internal monologue that had oscillated between confidence in my vision and doubt about whether the world would ever recognize value that came packaged differently than expected. The difference was that Keisha now had support and resources that I'd lacked, a network of people who believed in her potential rather than questioning her choices. The hardest part isn't the work, I told her honestly. It's maintaining faith in your vision when everyone around you is telling you that you're wasting your time. But here's what I learned: their inability to see what you're building doesn't make it less real or valuable. It just makes them blind to something extraordinary happening right in front of them. As my wedding date approached, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me from that humiliating night at the Phoenician to this moment of confident preparation for a future built entirely on my own terms. The woman who'd been turned away from her brother's wedding for being too embarrassing had become someone who no longer needed anyone's permission to exist in the world she'd created. The transformation hadn't been about proving my family wrong, it had been about discovering that their opinion of me mattered far less than my own understanding of my worth and capabilities. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Williams Tech Solutions announced a major partnership with a national retail chain, a deal that would expand our software implementation into hundreds of stores across the country. The contract represented years of work, countless hours of development and refinement, and the vindication of my belief that hands-on research would produce better solutions than purely theoretical approaches. More importantly, it demonstrated that success built on unconventional methods could compete with and even surpass what traditional paths produced. On my wedding day, standing in Sedona's Red Rocks with Ryan beside me and a small circle of people who truly knew and valued me, I felt complete in ways that had nothing to do with professional achievement or family reconciliation. The journey from grocery store cashier to successful CEO had taught me that worth wasn't something other people granted or withheld, it was something I claimed through my actions, my choice, and my refusal to accept others' limited visions of what I could accomplish. Mike never attended my wedding, but his absence felt appropriate rather than painful. The relationships that mattered were present, the people who'd supported me through uncertainty and celebrated my successes without needing them to conform to conventional expectations. My parents came, though their presence carried the weight of years of misunderstanding that hadn't fully resolved. But Lauren was there, and Ryan's family, and colleagues who'd become friends, and foundation recipients who'd seen in my story a reflection of their own struggles and possibilities. As I said my vows to Ryan, promising partnership built on honesty and mutual respect, I realized that the greatest gift from that terrible night at the Phoenician hadn't been the revelation of my success to my family. It had been the revelation to myself that I no longer needed their recognition to feel whole, that my worth existed independent of their ability to perceive it, and that the most important approval I could earn was my own. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.